So welcome to the fourth in the series of Classics Confidential interviews on the theme of religious scepticism. Today I'm in Oxford with the wonderful Bettany Hughes, author of, amongst other things, amongst many books, the Hemlock Cup and a specialist on Socrates. So we're going to be talking mostly about Socrates and religious scepticism through that particular lens. So Bettany, can you tell us first of all what your take is on Socrates, why he draws you, why you're drawn to him, and how you conceive of him as a figure?
I think it's a mixture, both in a way of his unknowability and his tenacity. So he's this great paradox, Socrates, that obviously he died 2,400 years ago, and yet there isn't a single decade in human history when he's left the human radar. He's been talked about, debated, painted, his philosophies used in very substantial ways, both for good and bad, and interestingly both in the East and the West. I think we sometimes think of him as kind of, one of these fathers of Western philosophy, but he's as important in Arabic thought as he is in Western. So I think it's the fact that he matters, he has had real influence, and you could argue that aphorism of his, the unexamined life is not worth living for a man, gives us the modern world in a sense, in that it allows inquiry to be central rather than seditious. And yet, of course, he is this extraordinary enigma, a man who had an allergy to the written word. According to Plato, he talks a lot about the danger of the written word, that once it's out there, a word no longer has its father to protect it, so it's an orphan, and the problem for us historians is that has meant that he hasn't left a written record, as far as we know, of his ideas. So we're relying on all these periphery sources, to Plato, Xenophon, where Socrates appears in Aristophanes, for instance. So he's a challenge. So this is a very honest answer to your question. That's why I thought I'd like to try to sort of wrestle him to the ground, because I knew it would be a vigorous and lengthy job, but therefore kind of all the more exciting for it.
Yes. Great, so he's a kind of absent present for you.
Yes, yeah, he is. I mean, this is there's a story I often tell about this, that I was sitting with Mark Haddon, the author of The Curious Incident of the Dog at Night Time, and talking about what books we were writing, and I asked him what he was writing next, and he asked me, and I said, well, I'm writing this book on Socrates. He said, oh, that's a brilliant donut subject, really rich and satisfying, but just with this great big hole in the middle where the central character should be. So when I was writing it, I had this sort of spectral donut over my head. But I think that shouldn't mean that we turn our back on him. It shouldn't mean that we don't try to somehow piece together the jigsaw puzzle that is the historical Socrates, even if it's only so that we have a clearer picture through which to understand his philosophy.
Now, I'm obviously interested in him primarily as somebody to hang the question of ancient atheism, ancient disbelief onto. So what's your take on the divergence between the Aristophanic presentation of him as somebody who really doesn't believe in the gods and the Platonic and Xenophontic one, which seem to try to reclaim him, promote him as somebody who may not believe in a conventional form of divinity, but believes in an alternative and no less pious religion?
Well, as a historian, it would seem to me extraordinary that there would be anybody living in 5th century Athens who really didn't believe in the gods in any sense, so was an atheist as we understand it. So somebody who just thinks that there is no spiritual dimension to the world, there are no gods, there are no divine beings. Because as you know only too well, in ancient Greece there is no separate word for religion. Gods and goddesses and demigods and spirits were believed to be everywhere and in everything, around every corner. And even though the nature of those divinities could be debated and was debated, particularly in the 5th century, and I think Socrates is a part of that, I just think it would be extraordinary to have an individual who absolutely denied the presence of any kind of spiritual force. Yeah, that is
what Aristophanes in effect says of Socrates.
It is, but I mean, I think, isn't that because I think that what Socrates does, which is extraordinary and liberating to humanity, to be honest, and brave, is that he allows the focus to be on an inner morality and the possibility that you become the best human you can possibly be through internal dialogue. So you're not just a plaything of the gods. There is actually something that there is a way that you can change yourself, and therefore that you can change the world. And that sort of internalisation of what it is to be human was, again, it sat very uncomfortably in 5th century Athens, where everything was done publicly. You know, religious practice was shared. There are 2,000, I think, kind of divine possibilities in Athens in the 5th century, but you worshipped all of those with your family together at a shrine or in a temple or in a sanctuary or at a festival. This wasn't a personal thing. There was no such thing, I think, as personal belief. So the fact that Socrates has this sense that there is something powerful within all of us, also this odd thing that he has that we still haven't quite pinned down, but this strange medical condition that he seems to have had, which we think now might be catalepsy, where he stops and stands, we're told by Plato, stares kind of for minutes, hours, sometimes even a day at a time, which would again have been very, very, very troubling to the ancient Greeks. And he describes this as part of his daimonion, you know, his the inner demon, spirit that speaks to him. So I think that Aristophanes is kind of just playing with all of those in his clever, meddling, dangerous kind of brinkmanship way, which is what Aristophanes does with ideas and words, and saying Socrates is unusual, he doesn't do things the normal way, he does something which is potentially offensive, and therefore look at him, actually he is an offensive and ridiculous creature. I mean, I actually think Aristophanes quite likes Socrates.
Right,
I don't think it's malicious. I think they were sort of sparring partners, I'd imagine. But there we are, the text of Aristophanes, that's the incarnation of Socrates' anxiety about the written word. The problem is you can say something to mates at a table and it can be funny, but as soon as it is immortalised, then its interpretation is always open.
So do you think it's a function of comedy's particular power to bully, as it were, to sort of pick on somebody who's a little bit different, who's other, and to put up barriers between the community who are united with laughter against an individual or a certain type of person? In this case, it's sort of a way out intellectual.
I think it is, but then it's also, I mean, we're absolutely living through this at the moment. It's also that difference between the power and nuance and subtlety of a moment where we can all share a joke, again, in the privacy of our home, in a restaurant, maybe with a kind of group of 10 people. But if that joke is then filmed and broadcast and shared on YouTube, it can become desperately offensive. And I know there is a lot of rather kind of pathetic defence of offensive ideas, saying it was just a joke. You should have been there. You didn't understand the nuance of the moment. And that's used as an excuse, I think. But there is also a truth in it. That we relate to one another in very complex ways. We judge one another. We judge how something is going to be received. And actually, maybe Aristophanes just thought, well, I think I'll get away with it. I think Socrates will understand. We're living in this democratic experiment where actually we're all trying out what it is to kind of speak our minds in public. But the issue being that is something that then stayed both in the memories and the imaginations of those who watched what he was saying about Socrates, and those people then live and are that's the generation that then tries Socrates in 399 BC, and also that it's come down time in the written form rather than in the heat, perhaps the dangerous joy of the moment. Yeah. So
it's actually said, isn't it, in Plato's version of the defence speech of Socrates, that it was Aristophanes' comedy that misled people into thinking that he was an atheist, if that's the right word to use, somebody who didn't believe in the gods. That's a characterisation that you would accept broadly, that Aristophanes' play was highly influential and actually steered the terms of the prosecution against Socrates?
I would say, yes, I would. I'd say it probably wasn't the only thing, but I think, again, something we'd all understand today is sort of trial by media. It's very easy for an idea to be put out there, given to the public, and the public runs with it because it gives them some sort of potency. So I would say that I would say that Aristophanes was not the final nail, but perhaps the first nail in Socrates' coffin.
So if we move after the trial and we talk about Plato and Xenophon as sources for Socrates' ideas, I mean, one version of it might be, and this perhaps you wouldn't be very comfortable with, but one version might be that they are rewriting Socrates in the light of the trial and whitewashing him. They're apologists for, I mean, Plato, of course, has got a lot at stake in the idea of rescuing the image of Socrates. So, I mean, a sort of contrary position to the one that you're taking might be to say that, I mean, actually Socrates was pretty controversial and was playing with some pretty dangerous ideas when it came to religion, but Plato and Xenophon are very keen to reclaim him, and obviously for their own purposes to protect themselves against similar kinds of charges. So they're apologists for...
I'm sure that's right. I suspect it's a wash of white watercolour rather than a kind of, plasticated whitewash that goes over Socrates. So I think that there is some kind of truth that comes through. But I think you're absolutely right. There's absolutely no doubt that Plato, who clearly loved Socrates deeply, and as you say, was then trying to protect himself in a very kind of fragile, febrile world, that he kind of cleaned up Socrates' act in a sense, tried to make him as charismatic and credible as he possibly could. What's interesting, the two things that are interesting, one is that we do a lot of comparing Plato and Xenophon, and it seems to me very interesting where they agree, because I don't think they sat down together and said, okay, this is what I'm going to say, okay, I'll do that as well. I just don't think that happened. So that's interesting that they have a kind of similar opinion of him. But also I think that, he probably was, he's deeply thoughtful, Socrates. He has what seems to be, as far as we know, an extraordinarily original mind. And I'm sure in that 70 years he spent in Athens, which was a superstitious, pious place, I'm sure sometimes he walked through the agora where, for instance, the tongues of doves were cut out and the blood sprinkled on Aphrodite's altar, as a way of invoking Aphrodite's power. I'm sure he walked past that and at some point thought, I wonder if this is the route to understanding the nature of love. Could it be something else? So I'm sure he questioned the orthodoxy, but I think that's a very different thing from turning your back on the gods.
Yes, okay, yeah. But it might be argued that, for example, Plato is often thought of as a religious writer, somebody who elevates ideas almost to the status of the divine and makes a firm disjunction between the mundane world that we live in and the world beyond, the transcendent, and for that reason has often been seen wrongly, but be seen as anticipating Christianity. But that comes in quite late in Plato's writing, so I wonder whether Plato becomes more religious and makes Socrates more religious in the course of his own career, Plato's own career.
Possibly. Although in a way I think it's simpler than that. I think you're right. I think that is what happens to Plato, and then we get these kind of crazy, brilliant ideas of what the physical is, and the potential, the kind of metaphysical potential of the physical. It's something that we've been talking about, this thing that he does with the word idea. That idea starts off in Pindar, meaning a form of, Pindar describes a beautiful boy, a dea te kalon, and then Plato does something very exciting about it and said, well, if that's a form, maybe there's an abstract possibility to that form, and therefore idea stops being a physical thing but becomes an idea about reality, and then a thing that can change reality itself. So those are all very exciting ideas, and I think you're absolutely right. His religiosity, or his kind of religiosity is probably the wrong word actually. I'd say
feel for the transcendent.
Sort of metaphysicality or something. I think probably does increase, but I'm not sure. As I said, I sort of stick to my guns, and that I don't think really there's any evidence that Socrates was irreligious in the Greek sense, apart from those jibes that are thrown at him, which would be because he was odd.
Yeah.
And the thing about being a pious Greek is that you weren't odd. You did things in the recognised, done, commonly accepted way.
Do you think then that, Socrates, okay, you've spoken about, but there are other people in that world of Aristophanes' clouds, in the penumbra there, floating around, who are accused by other figures of not believing in God? There's sophists like Prodicus and so forth, and materialists like Democritus, not in Athens but elsewhere. So would you be comfortable with the idea that there is an awful lot of really quite threatening serious philosophizing going on that addresses the nature of the divine in this period, and that, in a sense, the legal reflex, it's Socrates gets it in the neck, but that's really part of a collective social
kind of
anxiety about the questioning of the divine.
I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, I think we've got enough evidence of, some of it is later, some of it might be apocryphal, but of the trials that there were, Diagorus of Milos is another one described as an atheist. But, atheos, so kind of away from God, doesn't mean denying that there is a God, and I think that we've got to be terribly careful in the way that it's almost like we want there to be atheists in the 5th century, so we sort of desperately try to find them. But I think that is the very limit of those inquiries, of those rational inquiries, and a limit that possibly isn't ever reached. But as you said, those discussions are on the table, whereas 3 centuries before, well, as far as we know, we obviously don't have the sources. Maybe it was 9th century and 8th century were packed with atheists, but I think it would be extremely unlikely. And there does seem to be something now which kind of allows that more rigorous debate about what it is to be human, what it is to be human in connection with the world of spirit.
So perhaps just one final question, which would be about what you think Socrates means for us today, where you think we are with this questioning, inquiring spirit that he represents. Is it alive and well, or do we need to go back to Socrates? Have we lost something of that courage?
Oh, I think we have lost something of that courage, and I think in a way he saw us coming. I think his anxiety about a world that was governed by material desires is very applicable to ours. Again, it's a slightly later source, but it seems to ring true that we're told that he marched through the agora saying how many things I don't need. I mean, that's something I walk into a shopping mall and think that as well, but we're told that is what we need, and that's what will make us happy. So I think we need to kind of go back to his notion about how we live successfully in the world, and I think he has something extraordinarily exciting to say about what it is to be human, because it seems that to me that his if we understand these to be his ideas rather than just Plato's, his notion of the central power of eros, as in a kind of not sexual love, but a love of life, a passion for life, a sense that we should never just live life but love the living of it, seems to me what it is to be human. So both a desire to live well, and also a desire to do that through our relationship with those around us, which surely encapsulates the best way that we can possibly be as a species. Socrates thought that ideas had to be communicated. Face-to-face conversation and dialogue was essential, and if we follow those 3 precepts, that we love one another, we care about those around us, and we share ideas, that we might be on a path to happiness.
That's a wonderful point at which to finish. Bethany, thank you so much.
Not at all, thank you.